Hi. This is really scary, actually. So I'm not a very good public speaker, in all honesty. I read all these books, and I'm trying to figure out like how to do it. And they said, start your presentation with a compliment, like compliment the audience. But you guys are way too smart for that shit, so I'm not going to do it. You see what I did there? That was awesome. Really not that clever. I think the reason I'm here is probably because of this image. This was May 24th. This was the day that I was on top of the mountain, on top of Everest. This is right below the summit. And we'd been using Snapchat to document this story, and it had sort of blown up in a way that we hadn't really anticipated. Adrian Ballinger, who's in the audience, had turned around at this point, and I was kind of alone, and I had some time to think, and I've had some time to ruminate on it since. But before I get to that story, I'm going to back up, and I'm going to show you how fucking cool I've always been. Like legit, think about that. Sideways trucker hat at 3. I was the first hipster. But honestly, the more to the point of the story is I'm in a campground, and that's how my life has always been. I've always been outside, and my parents were really, really adamant about getting my brother outside, engaging with the natural world. And that's how my entire young life unfolded. What's interesting about this is people think that it's sort of like that was a natural thing, but the truth is that I'm a very uncomfortable person. I'm a very insecure person. I've never felt like I really fit in, and some friends might dispute that, but the truth is I've always felt like a shapeshifter, like I couldn't fit in anywhere. And so what I did was I found identity in the mountains, because the mountains themselves didn't require me to be anything else. I could just be myself. And in the mountains, I also discovered very early on that rules, for the most part, are arbitrary. This was something that I learned from my dad through climbing. The things that might look impossible, if taken in increments, if taken in small steps, usually aren't. If we break things down and look at them holistically, we can usually accomplish almost anything. And the other thing that's really important to know about my adolescence is that I was a super, super, super smart kid. No bullshit. No, I was really smart. No, I'm kidding. I did go to high school 2 years early. And that was both to my benefit and detriment. And the reason being was because those boundaries that I had learned to push outside, I started to push inside, internally and socially. And when you're 12 years old and you're hanging out with 18-year-old kids, that's a pretty seductive realm of social intrigue that can draw you off course. And by the time I was 13, I just basically stopped going to class, and I was doing drugs, and my parents were mortified, and they saw my life derailing, and so they put me in a behavioral treatment center. It was based on the 12 steps, and this place was horrible. I was there for 8 months, and my parents really didn't know what to do. That was the only vice that they could get, and put me somewhere and feel as though I was safe. It was about 20 minutes north of our home in Salt Lake City. And years later, I went back as a young photographer, and I started taking photos. I asked for access to this place, and I walked around and I started taking pictures. And the pictures to me reflect a deep sense of sorrow and sadness. And I look at these places where we try to quote-unquote rehabilitate adolescents, and I look at what adolescents are sort of put through and what they have to endure. Because ultimately what I learned here was not that I was a valuable young member of society and that I mattered. What I learned was that I was inherently broken and I needed to be fixed. And it was because of that toxic lesson that I learned, and I still carry with me, that I'm somehow fucked up, always. It's because of that lesson that I ran away from rehab 3 times. And you can imagine what that does to a family. My parents thought this was the best thing for me, and yet I'm fighting that as well. I continue to fight it. I kept fighting it forever. And you can see how tired my parents are here, and that's because ultimately they had to make the decision to let me go. It was either enable me or let me go. And enabling would have destroyed the entire family. So they made the best decision for them, and I do not blame them for that. But that had landed me in sort of a homeless state for a while. And the time I spent on the street was pivotal for my development because it really gave me a look into what humanity boils down to. And it gave me a very curious empathy for people who are less fortunate. And it also gave me a look at sort of the reality of the human condition and what we are both capable of in acts of aggression and kindness, and more importantly, what we can overcome. And I really now look back and I see a profound connection between the years I spent living on the street, or the time where I was not at any, I wasn't safe in a house, and the way I took pictures outside. And that to me has translated consistently. With time, as I got out of that state of sort of quasi-homelessness, which took many years, and it took my parents coming back into my life, it took many friends and family, it took a village. But with time, I gravitated back towards the mountains, which were the only place that I had ever felt secure and I had identity. And honestly, climbing is a wonderful allegory for human struggle. It's a perfect storytelling tool. It offers a perfect vehicle to speak of our capacity. And my early career was all about this display of struggle hidden behind sort of a veneer of awe. But honestly, still, I was always interested in the humanity behind it. I took this picture 11 years ago. I was 24 years old. And in hindsight, I think this changed the direction of my career forever, because somewhat immediately, I could see that exploration or climbing was useful only insofar as it facilitated the making of images that could actually incite social change, right? The act of climbing itself is very self-indulgent, but used as a vehicle to explore complexities of specific cultural, environmental, historical, or political paradigms, it becomes a perfect modality, to tell these larger stories. And all of that climbing and all of that travel eventually got me sponsored. And then I was being paid to go and take pictures on expeditions. And finally, I got asked to go to Pakistan and climb a mountain called Gasherbrum 2. And this was in the winter of 2010, 2011. The invitation came from an unlikely source, an Italian climber named Simone Moro, who has a very high-pitched voice. He talks like this. I'm not kidding. I can't understand a single word he says. And a Russian guy named Denis Rubko, who talked like this. I remember taking this photograph on summit day. We were climbing towards the summit. We're at about 25,000 feet. And I knew that we were going to summit that day. What I didn't know was what was going to happen after that. But I knew there was something special about this day, that it was going to change my life. You can see the weather's kind of closing out. That's the summit right there. And when I summited, when we came up on top as a team, I became the first American to summit any of the world's 8,000 meter peaks in winter. All the rest had been done by the Polish because they suffer incredibly well. I'm not kidding, like all the rest. And this was the first Pakistani 8,000 meter peak to ever be climbed in winter. And it was on the descent that the weather started to really deteriorate. I just want to point out, this is Simone in the tent, 3 grown men in a tent out of the wind, covered in down, and the temperature, the ambient air temperature, is minus 51. Taking pictures isn't easy, it's not comfortable. And as this storm started to evolve and get worse and worse and worse, it started to snow more and more and more and more. And this was the last day from our Camp 1 to base camp, and we were trying to move through this snow, and I heard this crack above me, and I heard what sounds essentially like a freight train, and I knew it was an avalanche, and I yelled avalanche, but you can imagine what it's like trying to run in snow this deep. And it hit us. It hit us full on, and I just felt myself going into a much darker world than I could ever imagine, being rolled and feeling my body weight carry me down. And I stopped, and my face was out of the snow, and immediately I thought, well, Simone and Dennis are dead, and I'm going to have to get down alone. And then I heard this voice, this very high, squeaky Italian voice. It says, "Cory, everything okay?" And I'm like, dude, everything is not okay, first of all. And I feel his hands on me, he starts to dig me out, and as soon as I can start to move, I can wiggle my way out, and I start to undig myself. And as soon as I got out of the snow enough to move, I turned the camera, I turned it on myself, and I took a photograph. And I look 90, and it's gross. My mom didn't recognize me in this photograph. I sent it to her, and she said, "Oh, that's nice. And who is it?" I said, "It's me, Mom." And she goes, "Ew." And I was in, "Ew, gross." And I'm like, "I know, it's weird." But more to the point is that we can all take selfies and get them on the cover of National Geographic. So keep doing it, selfie world. Thank you guys. I've never got it. But honestly, I want to really get to something very serious here. What I see in that face now is a severe trauma unfolding. I see a life that is about to be splintered, and I couldn't anticipate what had happened. When the brain prepares for death, as mine had done, it does a very funny thing. It gets trapped in the experience, and you do see your life unfold before your eyes, but it's never like you think. It's never beauty and sunrises and ponies. It's like parking tickets and Cheerios and shit. It's the weirdest thing ever. But if you don't have that, if you don't have resolution, what that conflict is called clinically is post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I walked away from Gasherbrum 2 unknowing of a very serious and profound affliction that I would have for my whole life. I went home and I got married. We had incredible friends. But immediately upon returning from this trip, I started to feel this disassociation, this same sense that I was somehow standing on the outside of my life looking in. Like, I couldn't understand anything. I felt this incredible weight pushing down on me. It was like a very loud silence. And I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't remember names. It was like this dullness with sharp edges. And it reminds me of this quote. It's by Tim O'Brien. It said, "They carried all that they could bear and then some, including a silent awe for the terrible power of the things that they carried." And what's worse is that this became my life, to stand on stage like I'm doing now and tell a story and show that same picture and show the film of me crying after the avalanche over and over and over again. And the funny thing is the brain doesn't know the difference between the initial experience and when you're telling the story or doing it again. If there's no resolution, you re-traumatize yourself. Likewise, it doesn't know if it was a car accident, abuse, an explosion. Trauma is trauma to the brain. The sympathetic nervous system has no way of discerning whether it's relevant or not, and yet because it happened in an avalanche, I felt as though this was somehow a lie. Like this couldn't be true. And I still didn't know what was going on. But Gasherbrum 2 didn't just give me that, it also gave me my in to National Geographic. Coincidentally, right on the border of, or where we were climbing is right on the border of India and Pakistan. And that's a conflict zone. And there was a military camp right next to our base camp. And so I started going over and taking these photographs of these young military guys and hanging out with them for a little bit. I mean, this war has been going on for decades. And the interesting thing is the largest danger here is not bullets, but avalanches. It's the environment, it's the cold, it's disease, it's exposure. And what we know of Pakistan is so backwards compared to what's really going on. These were some of the nicest people I've ever met, the most hospitable. I just want to point out the guy, wearing the bright white suit is actually wearing exactly the same outfit as the guy wearing the gray suit. The guy in the gray suit's been there for 3 weeks. It's hard living. The way this all came about was actually they came over and they started asking, "Hey, Cory, we know you have internet. Do you mind if we check our Facebook?" I was like, "Of course you can check your Facebook," which was really, I'm happy they could do it, but I have like 1,000 friends named Farouk, Mohammed, Ahmed. I'm on the TSA watch list. I can't get on a plane. It's like, it's getting worse. I don't know what's happening. But really, this was, right? This was an exercise in intimacy, and this exercise taught me about getting close to people, using nonverbal communication to tell stories that bring us all together. Like, honestly, who brings a purple tracksuit to a war zone? And moreover, who tries to dry that purple tracksuit in -40? Like, that makes no sense. But it's funny, it brings us together and it allows us to open the door to talk about the big issues that we need to talk about. Like conflict and the scars it leaves. Conflict is very serious. This is a foot of a Pakistani soldier frozen in the ice just next to our camp. And it's these huge misunderstandings that leave scars on our families and on our nations, and they're rooted in ignorance and fear. That's just bottom line. There's no way around that. Bertrand Russell says, "War does not determine who is right, only who is left." And I think that's very poignant. These photographs gave me an opportunity to put together a small package of images that actually convinced National Geographic to give me my first assignment. And I sent these in like this in like layout form with like captions. And the photo editor's like, Cory, you could just send JPEGs. Like, you don't have to make a PDF. My first assignment was to the border of Nepal and Tibet, an area called Mustang. My friend, one of the guys that's worked for me as an assistant, as an advisor, his name's Mark Stone. He's in the audience today as well. We went to Tibet to explore these caves, to use climbing, my background in climbing, to climb into these ancient caves and try to uncover the history of this area. And, you know, great adventure is really just a hook to talk about the things that matter, like science, and in this case, human migration. So we'd climb into these caves and we'd find things like Pecha, this ancient script, and we'd blow it off, and usually it was nothing, right? It was just, you know, tax records or something. But sometimes it looked like that. That's an illuminated folio telling us about, this is actually a Bun illuminated folio. This predates Buddhism. And finally, what we were looking for, ultimately, was a burial crypt, human remains. And what we needed to find was teeth, because we needed the strontium. Strontium is SR38 on the periodic table. It's basically God's, you know, geotag. And what we can tell from strontium is where we were born, right? So if you find somebody's remains in a cave on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and they were born in eastern Tibet, and somebody else was born, you know, down in India, then you start to paint a picture of human migration and trade. So piecing together these pieces of science was what this expedition was all about. And why is that important? You know, I ask these questions all the time. Why is studying human migration important? Why is telling these big stories important? Well, the point is that really we can learn a lot about our future and where we're headed and where we're at by looking at the mistakes we've made in the past and how our human family has unfolded along the way. So talking about history is not irrelevant. In fact, it might be the most relevant thing we can do right now to understand the pitfalls of our human family, of our human animal, where we're going to make the mistakes again. Because we tend to think that this is one big planet and it's all sort of not, it's sort of disconnected. But in reality, it's very finite. We look up at the sky and we think we're floating in this infinite space, and that's true. But Earth itself, our home, is finite. In the field, you know, I felt so connected to everything. It gave me distraction. It helped me focus in. But then I'd come home and I'd feel so disconnected. I couldn't really describe it. And I started to hate coming home because I wasn't stimulated. I was bored. There was this silence. I'd have to sit in that quietness and feel this overriding pain, and I didn't know what the source was. I didn't know that it was coming from the trauma of my adolescence, the trauma of the avalanche. And I felt myself withdrawing further and further and further into this very deep sense of loneliness. And I felt like the darkness inside of me at one point had somehow erupted, and now it was the darkness all around me. And like so many people do in these situations, I started to drink really heavily. And, you know, I'd wake up in the morning and I'd promise myself that I could make it to happy hour, and then by 3 I'd have a drink. But it wasn't any big deal, right? Because I'm not getting drunk, nobody would really know, but I kept drinking. I kept drinking to get away from everything that I was feeling. And finally that time of day started moving down. I'd never drink before noon, and then I was drinking at noon, you know, having a beer with lunch. And by the end of the day, you know, even on assignment, sometimes I had 8 drinks. And I didn't want to name it at the point, but I was falling quickly into, you know, a very serious problem with alcohol. And in the field, you know, I wouldn't do this as much because I felt completely satiated. You know, I was stimulated, I was ignited, I was passionate, I was creative, all the healthy things. But eventually, even going to these places became an escape. And I escaped to every place I could think of. I went to Indonesia to look at the Bajo, the sea gypsies, These guys have lived for hundreds of years nomadically on the seas. They rely on the health of the oceans to survive, the health of the ecosystems. They need these ecosystems to be intact. And what I was looking at was what happens when governments mandate that a nomadic people now settle, right? And they did this because they didn't want the Bajo to continue to inadvertently cross international boundaries, end up, incarcerated and imprisoned for life without without any sort of judiciary system in place to get them out. But of course, when governments act laterally like this, we have consequences, huge consequences. What happens when they're no longer moving dynamically through ecosystems? Well, they start to overfish where they are. And then they start to acquire more, and it takes more to sustain life. So they're no longer just using gill nets. Then they start using bombs. And what happens when they start blowing up the reefs? Those reefs are gone. Bomb fishing destroys the marine ecosystem for decades, hundreds of years sometimes. It destroys families, it destroys people. This guy had been in prison 5 times for bomb fishing, and every time he went back to it because they were trying to adapt to a way of life for which they have zero cultural reference. And this is happening all over the world. And sure, there is beauty. Beauty persists. It persists everywhere. But I began to see more and more profound examples of the consequences that arise in the wake of the pursuit of sort of political and economic interests, when governments act out of self-interest versus self-preservation. They're two very different things. I went back home to the American West, and I worked on a story for National Geographic on Yellowstone. I was looking at the relationship between people and predators and sort of the deep cultural and idealistic divides that exist right here in our own country. It's funny, it started to occur to me that when we extract right and wrong from a scenario, our ideas of that, all we're left with is the truth. And what is the truth of how we as humans actually see the world? Is it ours to command, or are we simply just a part of it? I think most of us in this room have an answer for that, but others would have a very different answer. What do our actions tell us about what we actually think? Not just what we think idealistically, but what do our actions tell us about how we are planning our future? How does that balance against what our trajectory requires? I mean, as a part of an ecosystem, who are we? What are we? What's our responsibility? Just to give you an example, 200 years ago, there were well over 20 million bison in the American West. And they're perfectly evolved for this landscape. And they know how to handle predators, they know how to graze, they know how to provide for the landscape that they inhabit. And over the course of 200 years, we brought that number down to about 5,000 wild bison. And we completely replaced them with a separate species of ungulate. We all know what that ungulate is. And that, cattle, they have no evolved reference for this landscape. And because of that, we've ended up eradicating the predators that then threaten the livelihood the livestock provides, right? And we fundamentally alter the landscape. And what's interesting is that we have this crazy idea that we as humans can erect fences and walls, and it's going to keep us safe. But the truth is that what wants to cross a fence will always cross the fence. Walls may or may not keep people out, but they certainly lock us in. That's one truth about walls. Ecosystems, social, natural, dynamic, they don't care where we put up a wall. And right now I'll tell you, they don't give a shit who pays for it either, because it won't matter anyway. Walls, physical or ideological, are grown from intolerance. That's the bottom line. They are the root, of so many issues. And the root of intolerance itself is fear. And fear is a source of conflict. Conflict is, I think, fed and leads to ignorance. Fed by and leads to ignorance. My next assignment was to Burma, to Myanmar, to the northern reaches. And it was actually, the reason we were doing this assignment was because of conflict, because of decades of civil war. So much of the northern reaches of the country had been off limits. And at times, all knowledge had stopped coming out of these places. So there's this seclusion that's driven by conflict, and time and progress have this way of halting. They just grind to a standstill. So because of the war, because of the geographic knowledge of the region was so stunted, pieces of the map were left very blank. And because of our specific skill set, we were going in to climb, to measure, and to map the eastern tail of the Himalaya, which was known, there's very little known about it still. So we decided, of course, as I usually do in life, to take the absolute hardest way to get to the mountain. This is a theme. We packed onto overnight buses, and then we took a boat up the Irrawaddy River to kind of look at that as a thoroughfare and a means of transport and trade. We rode a portion of the Thai-Burma Railway, also known as the Death Train. You guys should Google it. It's hysterical. Like, you're just waiting to die as you're like going, because you think you're going to derail the whole time. I got off the train with, I'm not exaggerating, 50 spider bites, which I'm surprised didn't kill me. I'm not a very big guy, but I guess I had enough poison running through me anyway. Speaking of which, we rode motorbikes about 80 miles into the jungle before we started a 150-mile walk. But these guys were pretty affected by the conflict in so many ways. We called them the baby's Hell's Angels. This guy opened a beer at 7 in the morning, and I was like, whatever, I've done it. I get it, cool, no judgment. And then he dumped some out. And I was like, some for the homies. Nice, dude. And then he cracks a mini bottle and just dumps the whiskey on top of the beer. And I'm like, I'm going with that guy. That looks like fun. And we crashed, but whatever. For those of you who haven't walked 150 miles through the jungle, don't do it. It sucks. You never have to do it. Once I got over the snakes that wanted to kill me and the spiders that obviously wanted to sleep with me, because who doesn't? I'm totally kidding. Only spiders want to sleep with me. And the trees that want to stab me. I was left to this silence, and my life around me started to really come into sharp relief. What was happening at home? So this is countless of sweaty hours of time to ruminate on all the things that I had been using alcohol and other addictions to avoid. And the silence was truly oppressive. And I could just walk for hours a day and get further and further into myself. We come to villages that have been locked away for the most part for hundreds of years, and they reminded me in not so subtle ways of one of the very first images I showed you of the woman on the bench. These are foragers foraging. These are people surviving. If you need food, you kill it or you grow it. If you get sick, you either get better or you die. There is no escape, there is no road, there's nothing to take you out. And it's a reminder of how incredible we are as an animal and how much we can endure. And it's funny too, because we walked, like I said, for 150 miles and we never saw the mountains. And I was beginning to wonder if this was just sort of like walking towards a horizon. And then finally, the mountains just sort of erupted. They came out of the jungle in a single day. We hadn't seen a mountain the entire time, and then we arrived. And it had taken us 30 days to get to this point. And I think we had really underestimated what we were trying to accomplish. We had given ourselves over completely in the first month, and we still had to climb the mountain that we had come to climb. And I myself was swimming in a pile of issues, and I could barely see through it. And I was scared to be back in the mountains. It was the first time I had gone back since the avalanche. I was scared to be climbing. And I think I was scared of my ability too. I was scared that I'd let everybody down. I was scared that I wasn't good enough. All of those insecurities that I had gone to the mountains to get away from came flooding back, and it was so confusing because here I was in the mountains where I thought I was the most comfortable. My partners didn't know it, but I literally could barely move at times, looking up the slopes that we had to walk up. And then I'd have to make this decision like, well, fuck it. I'm in, and I just follow blindly. And after 40 days of movement, 40 days through the jungle, 10 days of climbing, we finally saw the summit for the very first time, which is that snowy point just above Mark Jenkins' head there. And less than 24 hours after I took this photograph, we turned around. We turned around short of the summit. So we failed. This was a huge expedition for the magazine. This was a huge story. And we failed, and I failed. I had brought too much with me. I don't think the success or the failure of this trip relied on me, but I do know that the weight of the pain that I was carrying with me, carrying inside, was pulling me down. And how could I be a good partner with that kind of monkey on my back? It reminds me of that old saying, let go or get dragged under. And I could not let go of the things that I was experiencing. So we failed. And we had to surrender that failure, and I had to take a long, hard look into what had precipitated it. I mean, ignorance fueled by conflict had brought us here, but we, or at least I, had come here ignorantly as well. And I had to look long and hard at failure and what it meant in my entire life that was basically a whole bunch of little, or big failures that ended up in little successes. But what came from that was that I wasn't living honestly. I knew that I wasn't living honestly. Behind the scenes, behind the climbing, behind the social media, I was falling apart. Gasherbrum 2 happened, and my career went like this, and my personal life just slowly started to fall apart and unravel. I was fractured inside. People saw the social media. They see things like Snapchat. They see things like Instagram. But they never saw me drunk in a hotel room alone after giving a talk. Nobody ever saw that. Most people are scared to talk about it. Most people don't want to see that. But I was hiding a piece of myself, and I was being dishonest to everybody around me. And the space between the two realities kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I knew I had to return home to a marriage that I had neglected and was failing. For the most part, my marriage was over because I was a bad husband. This hum of this trauma in my life, the issues that I had never resolved from childhood, that had amounted to me going out and throwing myself against mountains and trying to overcome everything around me rather than dealing with the issues that I had inside. That had amounted to me being one of the worst husbands you could ever be. The ego of my success had sort of allowed me access to these distractions. I was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I had no idea who I was. I was in a complete identity crisis. The idea of being comfortable in your own skin was like speaking Japanese to me. So I left my marriage, or I should say my marriage completely blew up, as they often do. And I found myself wandering again, and I felt myself searching in my photography, looking for explanations. And it got grittier. And again, I just felt like I wasn't fitting in anywhere in life. I was completely lost. This is how I left the house. Really the last time. And I wanted, I was so broken by this. I wanted to pick up all these pieces of the puzzle that were sort of on the floor in front of me and figure out what had happened. But the thing is that you can't do that when you're in so much pain. And yet I didn't have time to try and figure it out either. I was just out the door, on to the next assignment. And that assignment took me to Angola, Namibia, and Botswana. The exploration component of my career was really expanding now, and I was looking at bigger issues. It wasn't just climbing anymore. And in this case, we were exploring a river system that connects from Angola through Namibia down into Botswana. The premise of the assignment was to actually do the first ever descent of the previously unexplored Quito River catchment. And this catchment itself provides the Okavango Delta, which many of you have probably heard of in Botswana, with up to 70% of its water. It's literally the beating heart of southern Africa. Every year it floods with 11 cubic kilometers of water, and all the animal migrations come in, and then it dries up and they disperse, and it does this every year, like a beating heart. But the Quito catchment originates in the Angolan highlands. And this is an area that is still in the shade of the fog of war. The war ended about 15 years ago, but it's left hundreds of thousands of landmines still in the ground. And these things are diabolical weapons, diabolical in every way. They're designed to maim. So many of them are not designed to kill. They're designed just to take off the lower portion of the leg. It's just to divert resources in a ground battle. So to leave the mines in situ is actually a complete impossibility. It would be, it's a humanitarian crisis as it is. But oddly enough, to remove them is equally as devastating, because the first thing that happens when those mines are taken out of the ground is people move in, they deforest, they chop down, they make charcoal, and they sell it illegally. So it's a catch-22, it's evil. These bags are all charcoal, hundreds of trees getting shipped off to Luanda to be burned. This is a photograph of the actual source of the Quito River. So the forests here are very much intact. We worked with HALO, which is a demining organization, to get into this. We found this on Google Earth and made our way in. And the plan was to put our makoros or stand-up canoes on the river there and just start floating. You can actually see a little trickle of a river come out the bottom. And we were absolutely so wrong about how easy that was going to be. For the first 10 days, we couldn't even find enough water to float the makoros. And finally, when we did, we ended up dragging them behind us like sled dogs. 1,000-pound boats with harnesses on through waist-high razor grass for 10 days, making about a kilometer of progress a day. And finally, when we found enough water, we had to get in it and start chopping the banks. Now, bear in mind that there are crocodiles and snakes and all the fun things that you get, right? And again, this is like pure suffering. It comes back to that question of, why the hell do we do this stuff? Why? I love this photo of Steve. I mean, if that doesn't describe misery, I don't know what does. It's misery manifests thousands of sweat beads that we just couldn't get away from. But why do we do it, And why have I always somehow managed to find the hardest way to do everything in my life? I'm still asking myself this question, but I think the reason is answers. When we intentionally engage in the most challenging method, we're forced to face the hard realities of, the landscape, both internally and externally. And these journeys are about truths. They're about finding truths. They're about finding scientific truths. What does a whole ecosystem intact offer? What here is potentially at risk if this river gets dammed or used for resources? To give you an idea, in Angola alone, we found 6 new-to-science species of fishes. 6. That have never been discovered before. The purpose of this trip was to conduct a scientific, socio-cultural mega-transect of a river system in order to provide not 1, but 3 governments with enough information so that they could potentially act collectively, inclusively versus exclusively, to protect a landscape that is imminently threatened by development, especially in Angola, because they're feeling a lot of crunch from oil prices. We wanted to know the ecological fabric of this entire landscape, as well as how it was being used and by whom, right? We found people finally on the side of the river going down that didn't run from us. And eventually we had to walk inland 10 kilometers to find a village to trade for those chickens that you see on the ground. But the truth is that these villages rely, again, on an intact ecosystem. And they themselves are the ones that probably damage it the most. With modern and more invasive species trying to get what they need out of it, they're destroying the very thing that they need to survive. So their struggles, interestingly enough, are no different than the same, you'd think that, okay, that's kind of different than what's happening in the urban areas. But that's not true. What's happening in the urban areas is exactly the same. All these struggles, we sort of destroy that which we need. And it's mind-bending to me. It's such a simple equation. But by acting only out of self-interest, we destroy everything around us, versus looking at what everybody else needs and acting cohesively. We can't even have the conversation. And this is the same thing that our government is facing now, all governments. And it illuminates the irony that the very things that rip us apart environmentally and societally are in fact shared interests and goals. We just don't think of them that way. We think, I need this, and that's it. In this case, the resource that we were looking at is water. So how is water being used in Angola, and what is the threat there? What is the connective tissue? If water is sort of the fascia of the planet, when we pull one place, what does that affect in another? So how water is used upstream always affects how water is used downstream. So on an industrial level, down to a subsistence level, right? And what I started to see so simply was this story of our connectivity, our collective connectivity unfolding. And it's not just about humans, it's about wildlife, because this is really about Botswana and what happens in Botswana, right? They take in 400 million in tourist revenue every year, but they're not sharing that with Angola and Namibia, the two countries that actually supply this water. So on a micro level, this is a story about a cohesive, multinational ecosystem that's threatened to be pulled apart out of political self-interest. But the land itself doesn't know the lines, right? The animals don't know the lines. They don't know what's happening all around them. Crocodiles don't know. Elephants in Angola are unheard of because of the conflict, because of the way it's been pulled apart. The animals themselves are being torn apart. They're in a battle for life that they have no idea about. But I mean, this fight is bigger than anybody, I think, anybody even in this room really knows. You know, and it goes back to my first assignment. How many things do we have to lose before we're willing to embrace a different way forward? How many times do we have to learn the same lessons before we sort of become willing to try a different way? How many cultures have to go away? This story taught me so much in a very dark period of my life. There's the quote that says, eventually all things merge into one and a river runs through it. All things are connected. And you guys might be wondering why I would talk about a river system and then show a picture of a wife who's destroyed. Because all actions have consequences. You know, trauma had shattered me, literally shattered me. I lost myself. I lost myself completely. You know, when I say I was a bad husband, you guys are like, oh, I kind of get that. No, I cheated. I cheated a lot. I took a vow and I broke it. I was deeply unfaithful. And then I lied about it. To her face, to many people's faces. And I tried to drown my shame about that in alcohol. And I tried to drown the shame of alcoholism in the affection of others. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I lied more. And I got up on stage and I espoused the principles of integrity more. And these two worlds were just stretching. And I was living in the shadows that they kind of created. In 1 month, in 1 year, I detonated my marriage, I destroyed a relationship with my primary climbing sponsor, and I left my production company that I started with my 2 friends. I burned my life down. And I felt very much like that same kid sitting on that peak, that same kid who bucked the system when he was 13 years old, who was homeless, running around. I was alone, and it was dark, and I was just searching for answers. And thankfully, the same thing that brought me back from that point as a child brought me back from this one as an adult. And it's the same questions that I'm asking you. How many times do we have to relearn a lesson? So I was asked to go back to Everest. And it's funny because this all starts to connect here. You guys are like, thank God, because this is weird. I tried to climb Everest once before in 2012, and I failed because I had a massive panic attack down low on the mountain, very low on the mountain. And in fact, it was that very trip that had led to the initial diagnosis that I had severe PTSD. So I found it not so subtly appropriate that this road would somehow lead back to Everest. This is the north side, taken from Tibet. This is about 20 images stitched together. And I got to go back with a new partner, this guy. He's super tall. He's like 6'9", I think. No, he's like 6'2", and he weighs, what, like how much? Like 105 pounds, Adrian? It's really weird. He looks like his girlfriend calls him Stick, after Stick Bug. His name's Adrian Ballinger, and we went back to climb Everest without supplemental oxygen this last spring. And just to give you some stats, climbing Everest without oxygen, over 7,000 summits of the mountain, and less than 2% have been done without oxygen. But Adrian is, without question, the best partner I've ever had in the mountains. He puts up with my ego. He puts up with my emo bullshit. He's also the reason that I'm on stage today. It was his idea with his girlfriend, Emily Harrington, to snap the whole story. And at first I was honestly super resistant to Snap. I didn't want the distraction of social media. Social had me in a death spiral of comparison. It had me comparing my insides to everybody else's, my insides to everybody else's outsides. People were showing me this much of their life, and yet I had this huge reservoir that I was trying to deal with, and I was comparing my entire breadth of human experience to what somebody curated me to see, And so I didn't have a really solid, good, healthy relationship with social at this point. But honestly, it turned out to be one of the coolest things I've ever done. It's a rare opportunity to bring people into the Himalayas, and only now are we finding ways to tell these stories more effectively. And really what Snapchat amounted to was Adrian and I being jackasses half the time. Like, seriously. Oh, there's no volume. But I'm a background dancer, you can see. He's listening to hardcore rap, and I am listening to classical music. That's how different we are. I'm a much more refined human than he is. I swear to God, this is funny if there's noise, but whatever. We deal with it. I thought this was South by Southwest, come on. But what that did was actually give us a vehicle to tell a real authentic story. It wasn't a curated slice anymore. It was giving everybody the full picture of what it means. And we started with about 30 views per snap. And by the end, we were well into hundreds of thousands of views per snap. And we had over 2 billion media impressions on the trip. So think about that in terms of, and I don't want to make this into an advertising talk, but think about that. How effective is it when you're actually authentic? How much more do people connect when you stop just putting the beautiful stuff up, but you start putting the real stuff up? It's a real special privilege to bring people to this place. This is a party that I passed just below the summit. That's right, I was passing people without oxygen on Everest. I'm such a jackass. But we left the tent about 10 p.m. the night before, and I hope there's audio now for this. It doesn't look like there is. There's no audio. So I'm going to talk you through it. It's unfortunate, but basically I'm saying I'm better than Adrian. He had to turn around because he's kind of just not as good as me. No, that's not what I said. What I was saying is I'm close to the summit now, and I'm going to try and snap when we get there. Adrian had to turn around. And honestly, it was Adrian's decision to turn around that allowed me to summit. He was listening to our team and the advice from our doctor. If he had not done that, he would have continued to go. He would have gotten too cold. I would have been responsible for his safety. And quite likely when that happens, especially when you're climbing without oxygen, things go south really, really quickly. And people die. So this is the snap from the summit ridge, and I'm looking out over the Himalaya. And I was so keen to snap when I got to the summit. And I got there, and I pulled out my phone, and this is what it looks like. And I pulled it up, and I opened Snapchat, and the phone dies. We had a whole social campaign built around snapping from the top of the world, and my phone died. Which is what a great ending, seriously. Like, some things maybe just shouldn't be snapped, or maybe they should be snapped the next year, like this year, who knows, But there was some poetic justice in that, for sure. The top of Everest is a very simple place. I was alone. I stayed there for a total of 3 minutes. I didn't have any real revelations at the time, aside from that I was very, very scared. I wanted to get down. And I also thought, a very funny thought, this is as close as I'm ever going to get to space. This is it. So I reached up and I just touched it. That's it. That's as high as I can go. And there's some poetry in that as well. I ran downhill as fast as I could to get out of that zone, to get back with Adrian, and to descend all the way down to Advanced Base Camp, which would, where I'd finally be safe. And when we got down there, this is what I looked like. So this is after 40 hours of being awake, having been to the top of Everest and back down. And sort of the lessons started to pile onto me at that point and in the months following. I thought Everest was supposed to be some sort of cathartic act. It would punctuate this darkness that I was in. It would solve the PTSD. I would somehow vanquish my guilt. I thought it would be sort of a phoenix rising moment. And what I found instead was that I had literally run to the highest point on the planet, as far as I could go, to get away from myself and all of my shit. I had run as far as I could to escape my truths, and I couldn't bury it anymore. I couldn't. You think that's a success story, and at that point it's all good. It wasn't. In fact, so much of it started happening just then. Going downhill was the point when I started having to do all the real hard work. And allegorically, Everest is the point from which all else flows, right? At least that's what I see there. It's the connective tissue, and it's from there that I had to start going downhill and into all the things that I had to face. It's not just the issues that I have to face. I went down into the issues that I think we have to face, the stories that I tell. What do we do about the changing climate and how we're contributing to it? And what are the solutions for sort of the global corrosion of culture and the aggression that comes out of it? And how do we address conflict globally and locally? How do we look out for those affected by conflict? How do we address the issues that fracture lives? The issues like trauma, social trauma, societal trauma. This is a guy named Amon, a young woman in the audience named Erica Shea, works tirelessly to rehabilitate former child soldiers from the LRA in northern Uganda. This is one of the people that she works with. He was taken from his village 20 years before this picture was taken, and this is Christmas Day coming home. What do we do in situations like that? And where are the voices for the voiceless? And what would they say to us? I'm 35 years old. I have no real concrete answers. I have a lot of questions, and I've always had a lot of questions. And I feel as though my responsibility has always been to ask those questions and provide some visual cues. One thing that I'm certain of is that we'll find solutions. That's what we do. We do that very, very well. But I want to use photography to ask the question, how do we stop creating the problems that need the solutions? And so why do I get up here and talk about divorce and PTSD and alcoholism and infidelity and confuse the whole conversation with adventure and a river in Africa and, where is this going? And it's a simple answer to me. This isn't my story. This is our story. It's all connective tissue. It's all tied together. This isn't about me. It's about us. Because when we show up honestly, we start to connect, right? Our personal issues are inseparable from our global issues. Who we are inside dictates who we show up as on the outside. And if we're all tied together in that way, how do we honor that bond? And for me, it comes down to a very simple word, a very singular solution. And it matters right now. It matters so much. It's honesty. All we have to do is be honest. And we have to demand honesty of ourselves and everybody around us. And that means, that means our administration. That means our governments. Truth fucking matters. And we have to demand it. But we can't just go, hey, tell the truth, right? Because it starts with us. Because through honesty, we disarm our own judgments. right? We see how similar we really are. And without judgment, we can finally be empathetic. And through empathy, we foster connection and we find each other. And when we find each other, we actually start to listen. And when we listen, we know what's happening. And we start to solve the problems. So we have to demand honesty of our leaders now more than ever, right? But we have to put politics down for a side. We have to put our opinions down aside. And you just wake up in the morning and look in the mirror and say, what am I honestly? What secrets am I harboring? And how do I rectify that? And how do I show up honestly in the world today? How do I want to show up in the world today? This is the last photograph I'm going to show you. It's not mine. It's owned by NASA. It was a photograph taken of planet Earth on February 14th, 1990. So that little blue dot has been referred to as the pale blue dot. And Carl Sagan, who some of you might have heard of, he's pretty smart, a little smarter than me. He said this, he said, look again at that dot. That's here, that's home, that's us. On it, everyone you know, everyone you love, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines. Every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. That can make you feel pretty small, and it can make it all feel pretty insignificant. But I don't think of it that way. It makes it all feel pretty manageable to me, honestly. The answers to all the questions that I've ever searched for are right there. It's all right there, right? Those answers are all in this room. It's our collective experience. And you might take it like we're all floating around in this big nothingness. But the way I see it is that if all we're responsible for is a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam, then I think we fucking got this. Thank you guys so much. So I think we're going to take time for some questions. Lots of people are getting out of here. We went a little over, but a little bit. Okay. All right. Wow. First question is, what is the best advice I've ever gotten? Don't listen to Cory. No, I think the best advice I've ever gotten probably is that there is no path. A lot of times people want to know, how do I become a National Geographic photographer? How do I climb Everest? And there is no real answer. That, I had to follow a path that was completely convoluted and obstructed at times. And the only real advice is don't adhere to any idea of how to get to point B from point A, because you're going to find your own way. I think that's without question. And also, one time one of the guys that I really learned a lot of my early photography from, Andrew Phelps, said, Cory, remember, no matter how good you are at something, never let what you do become who you are. I.e., don't let ego become your identity. And I think that's really valuable advice these days too. So, what made me decide to wear flip-flops to speak? Do you want to know why I'm not wearing underwear too? Or straight comfort, yo? So how do I manage all my photography equipment on long trips? Equipment is made to be used, and it's made to be broken, it's made to be bent, it's made to be, screwed up. And I don't take care, I have a camera backpack. It's just like I was walking down the street here. I put it in a bag, and I tend not to fuss over it. Because the more time you spend fussing about how to take care of your equipment, the less you're actually going to shoot. And I think that's really important. People tend to pay too much attention to technicalities. So the next question is, what's the next big climb, the next adventure, so to speak? And it's Everest. I'm going back with Adrian. And yeah. And this year it's for Adrian. I'm there just solely to be with him, and we're gonna snap it again, and fingers crossed, the phone's gonna fucking work. So, all right, I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much.